The more ridiculous and indefensible a point of view is, the more people will be frightened to challenge it. Because, of course, the people who propose it know very well that if we could actually look at this in a reasonable and rational way, and indeed bring science to bear on it, we would find that things were very different from what this narrative encourages us to believe. It's simplistic in the nth degree. It's also infantilizing, isn't it, to say that people have no responsibility at all for their own behavior or their own outcomes, that it's all been determined centuries in the past. That's a very disrespectful way to look at people. It's untrue and it's disempowering.
Iain McGilchrist is a psychiatrist, a neuroscience researcher, a philosopher, and a literary scholar. He's a former Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, an Associate Fellow of Green Templeton College, Oxford, a Fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and has many other prestigious scholarly associations. He's the author of The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain, and the Making of the Western World, and his latest book is The Matter with Things. Iain, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a great pleasure, John. Thank you.
Now, a major aspect of your work, including The Matter with Things, is the difference between the right and the left hemispheres of the brain and the impact on how we see the world and how we interact with it. Can we start with a basic layman's introduction? Can you explain to us what that means, the left and the right hemispheres of the brain, how they play out?
Yes.
I'm sure you've done it a million times before, but we need to hear it again.
I never get the elevator pitch right, but there we go. The first thing I have to say is that most people will have heard that all that stuff about right and left hemispheres is pop science that was blown out of the water about 30, 40 years ago. And in a way, they're right, and in a way, they're badly wrong. What was being said 30 or 40 years ago turns out now to be not right, but that's the way science progresses. There was a lot of speculation after the first split brain operations in California in the 60s and 70s about the difference. And to begin with, people said things like, well, the left is rational, but at least dependable, not very emotional, and linguistic, whereas the right hemisphere is kind of slightly airy-fairy, given to painting pictures and this kind of thing. I think the safest thing to say is forget everything that you've heard about this topic. There clearly is a question to be answered here, even if we got the answer wrong. Why is it that the brain, which is an organ that exists to make connections, its power is in the connections between its billions of neurons, why is it divided down the middle? What's more, why are the two halves asymmetrical? And thirdly, why is the band of fibers, a relatively small band, I have to say, at the base of the brain called the corpus callosum, why only 2% of neurons cross it? Why is a lot of its effect allowing one hemisphere to tell the other one to basically keep out of it for now? So these questions fascinated me. Cut a long story short, I researched it for 30 years. And I think the point is this. It's an evolutionary adaptation that is necessary for all living creatures. And it's not just human brains that have this asymmetry and this dividedness. All the brains we know have it. Why? Because the creature has to solve a problem which involves paying attention to the world in two quite different, diametrically opposite, in fact, ways at the same time. One is to pay a narrow beam of highly focused attention to a detail that you're already familiar with, you know what it is, and you want it. It's basically usually food. It can also be, for example, a twig to build a nest or something else that you want in the environment that you're going to grab and you're going to utilize. And so important is this, that this is really the main function of the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere, meanwhile, has been left with the job of looking out for everything else, because if you're only looking at a 3-degree attentional arc, you won't spot the predator, so that you'll become someone else's lunch while you're getting yours. equally, you will miss your kin, your mate, your offspring. So there's two kinds of attention paid by the hemispheres. This is the radical distinction to make at the start. The left hemisphere pays a narrow beam attention to something it wants to grab. The right hemisphere pays broad, sustained, open, vigilant attention to the whole picture. And the way in which you pay attention changes what you find. So if you are looking for just a detail that you know what it is, your world appears to be made up of certain fragments that are fixed, isolated, explicit, and lifeless. Whereas if you see what the right hemisphere sees, it sees that nothing is ever completely fixed, completely certain. Everything is connected ultimately with everything else, that a lot of what matters is implicit rather than explicit, and that this is a fundamentally animate world. So those are the, if I had to do it very quickly, that's probably what I'd say.
Can I ask you a very basic question, Ian? Is it possible for us to be conscious that we're perhaps underutilizing one part of the brain and overutilizing the other, or vice versa?
Well, we become conscious by being able to see the bigger picture. So you can see there's a problem here, that if you're already locked into a very narrow picture, that of the left hemisphere, you probably won't know what it is you're missing. The left hemisphere critically does not know what it is it doesn't know. Whereas the right hemisphere is aware that the left hemisphere does certain kinds of work on its behalf. It should act as a support, as a kind of minister, as a high functioning bureaucrat, basically, to do certain fairly limited procedural tasks, which it can do quickly. And the right hemisphere, in the story of the master and his emissary, the master realizes that he mustn't get involved with certain elements if he's to maintain a true overview of the world. And so the left hemisphere has been deputed to do these things. So one of the problems is that I think a lot of people are not aware of what has gone missing from our world. And a lot has gone missing. I think in my lifetime, I've seen it accelerate, so that I've seen things like beauty, goodness, and truth all travestied and reviled, and a sense of the sacred, a sense of wonder. All these things seem to have departed from our lives. And now something like 80% of young people feel that their lives are meaningless. If asked about it, there's no meaning to their lives. And I think this is because we've prioritized the left hemisphere, which doesn't really understand anything. See, one kind of helpful soundbite is the left hemisphere apprehends the world. In other words, lays a hand on it to grasp it and get it. It's the one that makes us rich or powerful. Whereas the right hemisphere comprehends, which means gathers together in order to have a fuller understanding. So really and truly, the left hemisphere is not as intelligent as the right. And that's actually a literal truth. The right hemisphere is more important for IQ, for example, than the left. It's certainly more important for emotional and social intelligence. We've always known that. But it's interesting that it's more important for cognitive intelligence. And it's more important for taking in the world, attending properly, perceiving things correctly, making deductions from what it sees correctly. Whereas the left hemisphere on its own becomes deluded. And I'm not using that word in a sort of popular way. I'm using that in the technical sense that as a psychiatrist I use it. The left hemisphere believes, left to itself, some completely crazy things. So it is not true that the left hemisphere is dependable, and it's not true that the left hemisphere is unemotional. It quickly gets angry. Anger of all emotions is most lateralized to the left. So you've got a relatively unintelligent functionary that is able to manipulate things, and as long as it stays under the guidance of the more intelligent overseer, that's fine. But when it thinks it's the boss, then things go wrong. Now, in the world we're in, I see, and I think when people think about this, they will be able to think of many examples for themselves all around us, a world that is dominated by this view of purely utility, grabbing stuff, becoming more powerful, becoming richer, without any wisdom to go with this extraordinary expansion of power. And it's rather like putting high-grade weapons in the hands of toddlers because we've lost the wisdom we used to have while we've gained enormous power to destroy.
So, plainly, then, both sides of the brain are extraordinarily important if we're to flourish. Is it possible then, given what you've just said, to overemphasize, if you like, the pursuit of the right hemisphere, and how might that manifest itself in people?
Yes, well, I'm often asked this, but one of the differences between the hemispheres is that they attend to everything differently, including to their relationship. So, as I say, the left hemisphere is not aware of the importance of the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is aware of the need for the left hemisphere. So people say, what would it be like if we were in some way more in tune with, let's put it that way, our right hemispheres as a culture? Very balanced, because the right hemisphere knows that it needs the left. And what I've shown in The Master and His Emissary, I believe, is that 3 times in Western history, once in ancient Greece, again in ancient Rome, and in our modern world from the Renaissance onwards, there was a sudden flourishing of everything together, the arts, the sciences, all an enormous eruption of creativity. And then gradually each society became more sclerotic, more hierarchical, over uniform, uncreative, unknowing of the things that it seemed to have known before, and eventually collapsed. I think what happens is the society overreaches itself. A civilization can overreach itself. And when it does, it collapses. But I can't think of an example of a society that was over right hemisphere leaning, if you like, because when it's the right hemisphere is in charge, all is well, because it welcomes the knowledge of the left hemisphere. There's a maneuver I ought to explain, which is the way in which we gather our understanding of the world. Things, even new information of any kind, is first taken on board by the right hemisphere. It's then almost immediately passed to the left hemisphere to classify it, analyze it, break it down, and so forth. But crucially, the results of that process must be returned to the right hemisphere so that it can be incorporated into the now enriched picture of the whole. This is a bit like learning a piece of music. You know, you're initially attracted to it as a whole. You start to play it, you sort of break it down into bits that need to be practiced and so on. And you understand the theoretical structure of it. But when you go on stage to perform, you forget all that. But your performance is good because you went through that phase. But it's an intermediate phase. And what we're doing all the time is handing things to the left hemisphere, which breaks them down and says, "Oh, I've got it, I understand it." But it doesn't really understand anything. It needs to return this knowledge to the right hemisphere's capacity to see it in the whole.
We often hear it said that we've reached a stage where it seems we know more and more about less and less. You know, the accumulated human knowledge now is enormous and it's instantly accessible. So presumably the left side of the brain has never been better served, never been able to better perform its function. Yet, as you mentioned, we have this crisis of meaning. People are not happy. Material success. I mean, we would be the happiest people in the world the cosmos had ever seen if materialism made you happy. We're not. And we seem somehow unable to break free and to focus again on the things that you mentioned, truth, beauty, goodness, bigness, for want of a better word. It does seem to be quite a rapid decline, again, referring to what you said earlier. And we see it in our politics, I would think you could fairly say.
Yes, I mean, it usually is a rapid decline, by the way. It usually happens quite quickly when it gathers momentum. And things have been deteriorating since the Enlightenment, really. The Enlightenment was a great, a great step in human thinking, but it was hubristic. It thought it could understand everything, and it can't. So basically, you say we've gathered a lot of information. This is absolutely right, but information is not understanding. Information is a step towards understanding, but it isn't an understanding in itself. And I think that what's happened, coming to the second rather different part of your question about can we see it in our socio-political world, I believe we certainly can. A number of characteristics, I think, will strike everybody. One is the rise of a kind of bureaucratic procedural way of thinking, which has no room for the actual reality of the individual case. Everything is subsumed into an algorithm. These algorithms are supposed to replace skills and wisdom which are acquired through the living of a good life, and they don't replace them. In fact, they cause a disaster, and the things that they're supposed to be helping and promoting become harder and harder to pursue. So right now, in the worlds I know, universities and hospitals, there are enormous, ever increasing bureaucratic structures in which the bureaucrats are recruited and paid higher salaries than the doctors, the professors, the people who actually do the business. So, this meta process, which is typical of the left hemisphere, a schematic, theoretical, abstract representation of a reality, is triumphing over the reality that it is supposed to be there to support. Equally, the left hemisphere wants things simple. It's not very intelligent, as I say, and it needs to be quick and dirty. So it's absolutely not the case that the right hemisphere jumps to conclusions. The right hemisphere is always saying, well, yes, but it might be something else. The left hemisphere jumps to conclusions. It needs to be if it's going to be an effective predator. It is effectively simply in the service of being a good predator. And to do that, it's no good going, well, could be a rabbit, might not be. You just got to go and get it. And so everything in this world has to be black and white. It's either this or it's that. But almost everything that is of importance carries shades of meaning. And what's more, we've lost through this simple idea of a path to the truth, that if you follow it, you get there. We've lost the reality that all things carry with them a shadow, which is at the moment not something we recognize. So if you follow a certain thing that seems good at the outset far enough, you will come to the very bad thing that you were trying to avoid. For example, a very obvious and simple one is individual freedom is up to a point an extremely important thing. But if you have absolute chaos and anarchy, there will soon be a tyranny. So you go back away from the thing you were pursuing. And this is happening in our world, this combination of a number of factors, reducing everything to procedures, to categories, doing away with wisdom, skill, and indeed common sense, so that we are led into fallacious views and we're not seeing where we're going. Often, when this is a psychologically valid observation, when people are absolutely convinced that they must be right. And there are, I'm afraid, people who are not even minimally skeptical about their own ideas. If somebody is absolutely certain that they're right, and you point out to them that the policy they've implemented is actually going to the wrong place, instead of saying, well, maybe we should rethink that and maybe we should take another path, they will redouble their efforts in exactly the same direction. I've seen this in every sphere of life in my 70 years. I'm sure you have too.
Yes, I have. I can't help wondering whether what we now call critical theory, the victim oppressor model, where we see people become, as you've said, if you dare to criticize the model, if you ask, is it really the case that the great evil in the world is racism and that whites are racist, they are the oppressors, everyone else is victims? You get this extraordinary response now from a lot of people where they just harden down, surely the very point that you're making, rather than standing back and saying, well, we've learnt actually through the ages that all races are capable of racism. All people are capable of great acts of nobility, of behaving very badly. To simply divide the world into oppressors and the oppressed, victims and victim makers, is absurd. And yet we find that quite literally, the minute you challenge that idea, quite often the reaction is so emotional that people, I've seen it happen. They will literally get up and say, I can't continue this conversation. It's too hard. It's too hurtful.
Yes. Well, of course, when the left hemisphere is challenged, it becomes angry. I did say anger is the first and most
Yeah.
characteristic emotion. Another one is scorn and distaste, disgust. So these are this is the exciting emotional range that one is met with. And of course, the more ridiculous and indefensible a point of view is, the more it will be, people will be frightened to challenge it. Because, of course, the people who propose it know very well that if we could actually look at this in a reasonable and rational way, and indeed bring science to bear on it, we would find that things were very different from what this narrative encourages us to believe. And the thing about the structure of what you're talking about is it's simplistic in the nth degree. It's also infantilizing, isn't it, to say that people have no responsibility at all for their own behavior or their own outcomes, that it's all been determined centuries in the past. Um, that's a very disrespectful way to look at people. It's untrue and it's disempowering. It's patronizing. So, but if you say that people play a part in whatever societal plight they find themselves, then you're told that you're blaming the victims. But look, life is complicated. There's going to be some blame to be shared. There's going to be things that can be improved on both sides. But just to say it's all about an oppressor and the oppressed is very strange, particularly in a world where people, generally speaking, enjoy, well, until very recently anyway, used to enjoy more freedoms than in any other part of the world.
Yeah, I think I'm quoting you accurately. You said something to the effect that abandoning reason is dangerous and can lead to the wrong conclusions, but actually, merely following it in a blind kind of way can lead to falsehoods as well. It feels contradictory to me on the surface of it to suggest that reason can lead us astray, or that even we can be both blind and rational at the same time. What is reason? And how can it blind us, and
Okay.
lead us astray?
I need to make a distinction, which is a distinction in other languages such as Greek, Latin, and German, between two kinds of reason. There is the mere carrying out of logical steps, which I call rationalizing. And there is reason, which is what you would hope
Right.
for from a wise judge who has experience, can think logically, but can also bring to bear a vast amount of information about context and history and so on to bear on the situation. So, reason is not the problem. A sort of narrow rationalistic approach is the problem. And I think that what has happened in our world is that we have banished reason, that balance of wise understanding with experience and the ability to see where things lead logically. We're losing that and replacing it by a mechanistic set of um, uh, unexamined principles chained together in unexamined chains of causation. And what I would say is that as a psychiatrist, you're particularly aware of this because perhaps the archetypal mental illness is schizophrenia. And as G.K. Chesterton already said 100 years ago or more, the madman is not somebody who has lost his reason. He has lost everything but his reason. So, for example, he's alone in a room. He hears a voice speaking to him. He looks around, there's nobody in the room. How can that voice be coming into the room? It must be coming through that plug socket over there because that's the only entry point in this room. And where does that go to? Well, it goes to my neighbor's house. My neighbor is persecuting me. Or perhaps the police are monitoring. So instead of thinking, maybe I'm not that well, people do hear voices when there isn't one, they rationalize about it and reach an entirely false conclusion. And there's a further point to make, which is that when we purely rationalize, we can only deal with one train of thought at a time. So when we explicitly work our way through an argument, we're thinking of only one thing at any one time. But as has been pointed out by a great German jurist, so a professor of law, uh, people in organizations should be encouraged to use their intuition, because their intuition roots all that thinking, which is very abstract, in the concrete realities of the lived world, and enables us to draw on perhaps 10 or 12 strands of experience and thinking at the same time. So it produces a much more subtle, balanced, and sustained kind of vision than reasoning in that way. Reasoning in the sort of very constrained way is necessary, but largely when things break down. So it shouldn't be brought into play until there's a crisis, and then you think, okay, now let's work out what this crisis is about. A.N. Whitehead, who I think was probably the greatest philosopher of the last 100 years, said that exercise of logical reasoning is like cavalry charges in battle. He was writing around the time of the First World War. Like cavalry charges in battle, it can only be made at decisive moments. It's very costly and requires fresh horses. So that kind of reasoning is to get you out of a hole. But if your life is governed by trying to follow rules like that, you'll stop living. I believe that is actually happening. I believe that I quote a German novelist of the 19th century who was already saying, life no longer lives. I think one of the key things about the world at the moment is the devitalization, the lack of spontaneity, the lack of trust or intuition, the lack of trust, in fact. All these things are not expressible in algorithms, but are crucial for a fully flourishing life.
I wonder, as I hear you talk, whether the way in which the Western world, in particular, reacted to COVID is an interesting example of left brain thinking. Very drastic responses we saw in Australia. I was really struck by the way in which our public broadcaster focused only on the health aspects of the pandemic. There was very little attention paid to the broader picture of what lockdowns would do to mental health, what they would mean economically, whether they were intergenerationally unfair. It was just all the time focus on the medical issues. Will people die? What will it mean for old people? Is that an example of what you're talking about, an inability to see the broader picture? And because it's I'm having a real go at our national broadcaster here, but it just struck me time and time again that they were not giving us a wide picture, which would have both better informed us, but also as a society encouraged us to think through the trade-offs, because there were trade-offs, and we look back on it and we think there were much bigger trade-offs than we realised at the time.
Yeah, I think there are two separate things in the picture that you've delineated. I wouldn't go to COVID as an example myself of the left hemisphere sort of getting it wrong, because it's okay with the retrospectoscope to see, indeed, that is what we should be doing, looking back and saying, well, how could we have done things differently? But there certainly was a point at which it was a really unknown crisis that could wipe out an enormous chunk of the population. In the early phases, it was virulent, and I nearly lost two close friends who were hospitalized and approached death. So I don't think either the right or the left hemisphere is necessarily going to be, as it were, responsible for making that decision. People had to act quickly and decisively, which is something the left hemisphere quite likes, it's true. But I think what I would pick up on is the national broadcaster myself, because the BBC used to be a highly respected voice, and it certainly lost a lot of its credibility to people in this country because it time and again takes one side and pushes that side. So at the time of Brexit, there was a very strong feeling that it was partial and wasn't giving a full picture. And now it reports on world situations with an obvious bias, I would say, without sort of mentioning that there are several ways of looking at this and doing it in a dispassionate way.
I accept your point that early on, particularly, it was a very serious prospect. We didn't know what we were facing. I do accept that point. I think my point would relate, though, as it unfolded
Yeah,
and it became obvious that there were very difficult choices that had to be
yeah,
made.
yeah.
There was a lack of explanation of those choices and the potential costs as well, which turned out to be massive. We know
Oh,
now that
I,
it
I
really has impacted very badly on our children,
I know that, of course, and I
the
agree with you
lockdowns. Anyway,
entirely. And the point there is that having taken a position, it wasn't willing to shift position. The right hemisphere is much more flexible, more willing to reassess and change course. The left hemisphere gets stuck.
so that's the Churchill line that only a fool doesn't change his mind when the evidence demands
Yeah,
a better course.
yeah, that's right.
You touched on freedom of speech, and I'd just be interested in teasing that out a bit. The relationship between the increasing domination that you're talking of left brain or left hemisphere thinking and the decline of liberty. Everyone talks about liberty. Everyone talks about freedom of assembly. Everybody talks about freedom, perhaps confusing it with license, which I think is what you're alluding to.
Yes.
Um, but is this one of the really pointy ends of the price we're paying for not standing back and using the right hemisphere properly?
Oh, absolutely.
This loss of liberty, this
Yes, it's not just, as it were, because of a narrow approach. It's because of its being a controlling approach. So, as I say, the left hemisphere doesn't like its position being challenged. It becomes angry and storms away from the table. And this is one of the problems with public discourse on everything now, is that there are certain things that can't be raised at all. There are very important questions that need to be asked, but they're out of bounds, as it were. And the desire to control the discourse reminds me of the Puritans. There's an enormous amount of the current picture that is very reminiscent of that terrifically destructive period of Puritanism, which fortunately in this country didn't last that long, but 11 years. But nonetheless, during that time, they managed to destroy works of art, destroy and literally piss on the sacred. And they had one truth, which is in this sacred book, and if you depart from it, then we'll have your life. And this is a terrifically bad sign when people start going down this path. There are already, there aren't public burnings of books that I'm aware of, although there may well be. But we're in that sort of a world. And as Heinrich Heine said, when they begin by burning books, they end by burning people. And I think that we're in a dangerous situation where people feel so self-righteous in a narcissistic way about their point of view, which they've never really allowed to be challenged and never thought about in a challenging way, that they rule out discourse. Now, the problem here is particularly acute in a university. The whole point of a university is to examine different points of view, not just to get more and more entrenched in a point of view that you inherited from pop culture and have decided is the only truth. But now in universities, it's becoming more like that there are accepted points of view, an accepted narrative. If you depart from it, you won't get a grant, you won't get employed, etc., etc., and people are frightened. Teachers at university, lecturers and professors are self-censoring. We know this from asking them that there's lots of things they would love to explore and say, but they don't because they don't want to lose their job.
I think Neil Ferguson, I don't think I'm misquoting him, said that something like 60% of university students say that they do not feel free to speak what they believe to be true.
And
on
that's
our,
the
in our
student, yeah.
in Western campuses. There's no real difference between any of the particularly English-speaking countries. They're all incredibly uniform with these sorts of numbers. Mental health amongst young people,
Yep,
you know,
yep.
the feeling that you've got to self-censor on university campuses and so forth. This is astonishing stuff and surely incredibly dangerous. How can a democracy work when there's no contestability of ideas, when no one can get up above, the fray of the moment and call for calm and a broader discussion? Can we survive it?
Well, will we survive for a whole host of reasons, some of them to do with pollution and destruction of the natural world, and some of them due to the breakdown of society. But the breakdown of society is happening very, very fast. I don't know if we can survive it. You can't really take a sledgehammer to a culture repeatedly and only take this attacking position and then expect people to see another point of view, to believe there was something worthwhile that was achieved by this culture. And of course, it's extraordinary that it is the relatively tolerant, the most tolerant culture that the world has ever seen, that existed in the 18th and 19th centuries. That tolerant culture of different positions has led to people being able to take advantage of it and attack it wholesale and do things that are completely wrong, but they feel are justified. Um, Anything really can be justified if you say this is the holy truth and we're going to go for it. It's the Puritans again.
I was intrigued that you, that you recently told Jordan Peterson that the problem with science today is that it isn't scientific enough, and that too often it's ruled by dogmas rather than evidence, the very thing science says it stands against. And I think you said that we're due for a paradigm shift. What did you mean? What do you consider to be today's unscientific science? And how do we need to tackle that, try and return science to a true spirit of genuine inquiry?
Well, the problem always comes when a very useful, invaluable, in fact, tool becomes the only tool that we use. So science is incredibly
Right.
important. I find myself defending science all the time, partly against political people who say that certain results in science simply shouldn't be published or shouldn't be discussed, even though it's good science. They will say it's pseudoscience because that's a very easy thing to say. Meanwhile, things that are in tune with the current narrative, even if they're incredibly bad science and never been replicated, will be quoted over and over again. But it's not really mainly that I'm talking about. It's about the left hemisphere vision, which is behind reductive materialism. So the idea that there is only a kind of lumpen matter that is made of fragments of stuff bumping into one another in a random sort of way and somehow miraculously leading to um, human beings and their achievements. But physics knew more than 100 years ago that it had to completely rethink the idea of a mechanical universe. It abandoned it. And physicists have been very keen to respond to me. I've had a lot of physicists write to me and say, your vision of the left hemisphere's take and the right hemisphere's take is very important to us as physicists. But biologists were left behind. So throughout that period, in the early stages, up until the Second World War, there were moves towards a much more holistic, organic vision of the living world. But with the rise of molecular engineering, genetics, and bioengineering after the Second World War, things started to look very limited and like an engineering science. And so you had the paradox that the science of life thought that everything was purely mechanical, and the science of the inanimate saw that consciousness was a part of the picture that could not be removed. So in the last 10 to 15 years, I'm delighted to say there are some important voices in biology. And here I would mention above all Mike Levin, a developmental biologist at Tufts, who have been making great headway in the idea that we have to completely reimagine what a living organism is. It's not before time, but it is gathering momentum. And, people are brought up to think that biology is just a special kind of a machine. But I don't want to go into a lot of detail here, but there's a difference between a complicated machine and a complex system. And organisms are complex systems which are inherently unpredictable. It doesn't mean to say that they're chaotic, but they're not entirely deterministic. And they involve an understanding of the whole, and that whole includes the environment along with the organism, and that the two co-create one another. There's just so many respects in which a living thing is not like a machine.
I'm interested in anything further you might have to say that, contrary to its own hype, science today is, as you put it, full of myths and narratives. Is scientism itself an example of that? And what are other areas that you think might illustrate that point?
Well, scientism
Science is, as you
exactly
put it,
one of
full
those.
of myths and narrative.
Yes, because scientism has its own myth, which is that science can ultimately explain everything. But it only recognizes things that can be measured and reproduced at will, more or less, in a laboratory. I usually ask people whether they've ever experienced love. If they have, they know that love is a very real thing. It's not a fantasy. It's not unreal, but you can't measure it and you can't manipulate it in the lab. There's nothing about it really that falls into this category. And the same thing can be said about consciousness. People with this scientific materialist and reductionist point of view try to go down and down and down into ever greater depths in looking at a cell and its constituents and so on, and can't find consciousness anywhere. And so they assume that consciousness actually doesn't exist. I mean, the thing that's so funny is that, of course, without consciousness, they couldn't even think that, they couldn't say that. Consciousness is the one thing, the only thing that we know, because it's what we experience. Matter is secondary in the sense that matter is something that we know only through consciousness. We don't know that we know consciousness only through matter. It could be the case, but I doubt it. But we certainly know matter only through consciousness. So consciousness is the one absolute reality. And so scientism has various misconceptions in it. For example, it must start, and this is not a criticism of science must start from certain principles, axioms, if you like. That we take these things to be true and we're going to build on these. And the difficulty is when it starts to pronounce on things that its axioms have ruled it out from knowing. So, for example, scientists are fond of saying that science has shown that there is no purpose. Science has shown that there are no values, they're just constructs. And science can show no such thing, because science starts from a perfectly valid position that it is not going to take into account what it calls subjective elements, which might include purpose and value. So it looks without those things and then says it can't find them. And to re-employ an image of C.S. Lewis, it's like a policeman stopping the traffic in a street and then solemnly noting in his notebook, the silence in this street is most suspicious. The science simply can't pronounce on these things. It's ultra vires. It's beyond its power to do that. So it's when people make these misunderstandings and become hubristic about what science can tell us. It can only tell us a small amount, But what it does tell us is very, very valuable. And politics should not be allowed to interfere with it. Because once it does, what is our touchstone? If people say, well, I think this is right and I think that is right, if we have no science to go on, science doesn't, as I say, actually find the final answer to everything, but it sure provides some very important bases for thinking about what it is we're encountering.
It does seem to me that we do a great deal of cherry picking now. So it's not long ago, I think you touched on this too, that the great cat's cry was tolerance. Let's be nice to one another. If that's your view, and we'll respect that. My view is different. That led to the idea of relativism, which makes politics very hard, by the way, because you can't speak truth to power. You can only speak power to power. The point being that if there are no truths, if nothing's absolutely observably true and straight and honest and what have you, then you can't speak truth to power because those in power will simply say, well, that's just your view. I have a different view. But as I say, we cherry pick, to pick up on what you've said. If you've experienced love, you know that you can't quantify that, but it's very real. We're now in an age of new absolutism in many ways. The rhetoric of social and climate justice, for example, it's hardly relativistic. It's often very absolutist, as we've discussed. But we're not absolutist, and C.S. Lewis saw the dangers in this in something like the things that you've talked about: truth, beauty, goodness, love. And if we start to say, well, they're only relative, it's not true for everybody, that sunset isn't glorious to me, so it's therefore not glorious, it's only glorious to you. It seems to me that we're in real trouble when we lose objectivity about truth and beauty and love. I guess that's the point that you're making.
Ah, well, yes. Once we get into this area, it's a bit complicated. I don't believe in absolute truths as a rule. Anyway, I mean there might be. I can't think of any off the top of my head. So there's a difference between saying this is the truth and there is one truth, and if you depart from this, you can't be right, and another which is saying that uh, truth is complicated, has different facets. Truth is rarely pure and never simple. So I, I gave a lecture to Oxford University recently about the dangers that began in the humanities with anything goes, and particularly that a certain dogma, say Marxism or feminism or whatever it might be, would be the way to critique a work of art. Instead of trying to discover what it's got in it that might be new, wonderful, and valuable, you subject it to your own court of law and say it fails on the following counts to have taken into its purview the thing that I think matters so much. So that, of course, is a terrific error. But it's equally true that, take the example of beauty. So it is true that all societies have ideas of beauty, and those ideas of beauty are not always concurrent. But it would be equally true to say that they're not just random. So a baby at 72 hours after birth will prefer to look at a face that has been judged beautiful by the people of the same race as the person, the face. They would prefer to look at these beautiful faces than at others. And on the whole, we have no difficulty in understanding the beauty of Chinese art, Japanese art, Indian art, Native American art, and so forth, and indeed Aboriginal Australian art, which I've seen when I've visited Australia and like very much. So there are different ways of expressing beauty, but it's not as though they're all a foreign language to one another. A nice piece of research shows that people intuitively understand what is being conveyed by a work of art. An Indian raga played to Norwegians who had no knowledge of the system of ragas in Indian music was able to say what the sitarist was, the sitar player was intending, and it coincided with what the sitar player himself felt he was conveying. So there's both difference and a great deal of togetherness. But there's also two different levels, if I may just say this. So while a particular judgment about what is considered good, beautiful, or true may differ within certain pretty clear bounds, it's not true that we just make up the concept of truth, beauty, and goodness. I believe these are ontological primitives. In other words, they're part of the structure of the cosmos. And Darwin himself made a very interesting observation. You can say that a bird is attracted to a certain color in a flower, or a bee attracted to a certain color in a flower, or a bird to the plumage of another bird, etc., because it's beautiful. But, and he repeated this, but where does the beauty come from? What is it that makes this beautiful? And that's something a lot of people haven't thought of. They just go, oh, yeah, so beauty is a mechanism that yeah, but hang on, but why? What is beauty? Where did it come from? And I think the answer is it's always been there. And I think it is our role as humans to respond to these values of goodness, beauty, and truth, to discover them, not to invent them. They're not things we made up in order to cheer ourselves up in our windowless cell. They're aspects of the world to which we respond. And when we respond to them, they grow. And it's helping these things grow that I believe is the business of a human life.
We touched earlier on the crisis of meaning, and you mentioned that rather extraordinary figure of the number of percentage of people who say they struggle finding meaning in life. And you've suggested that discovering, or at least looking for, a sense of the sacred can be part of the solution. Can you give us a feel for what you would mean by the sense of the sacred, and how you might go about that wisely? Assuming it's important, it would seem to me to be that many people go looking for the sacred and end up, if I can put it bluntly, in places where perhaps things aren't quite as they should be.
There is no infallible path to the sacred any more than there is an infallible path to love or to composing great music. It's something that you have a sense of, that you experience. And if you haven't experienced it, it's hard to describe, as it's hard to describe what it means to be in love to somebody who's never been in love. Doesn't mean that there's nothing to being in love. Doesn't mean there's nothing to being sacred. I think the important features of the sacred are that they speak to us of something that is bigger and more wonderful than we can know. So we are aware of something that is not just confined to the, after all, extraordinarily limited capacity of our human brains. Why imagine our human brains can understand everything in the cosmos? I mean, that would be illogical to leap to that conclusion. If you're rational, you don't think that. So being aware of and opening your mind to the existence of something that is bigger and beyond, that is awe-inspiring, and that induces a compassion, a feeling of wholeness, of togetherness, not rabid antagonism and violence. These are not the fruits of a sense of the sacred. And what I've just said would be supported in all the great, for that matter, religious traditions around the world, that compassion and love are part of the fruits of being aware of the sacred. And we know that there are three very important things for the fulfillment of a human life, and we've lost them all. One is the sense of a coherent society to which you belong, where people share your values, that you can trust them and you can worship with them, you can eat with them, and the commonness of your lives. That's one. The second is togetherness with nature, which until a couple of hundred years ago, 99.9% of people in the world would have had inevitably. But now only perhaps about 50% do. Being estranged from nature takes us away from insights into things greater than our own mechanical systems. And the third is the sense of the sacred or the divine or whatever you like to call it. And there's a massive psychological research on these, which I can summarize by saying that each of them has highly beneficial effects on psychological health and physical health, each of them, and on moral courage, on ethical standards of behavior, and on happiness. So when we seek happiness through the acquisition of stuff and control and power, which is the left hemisphere's agenda, we go astray at the first step, whereas we should be looking not for happiness in that way, but submerging ourselves in these relations with one another, relations with nature, and relations with the divinity in the cosmos. And that these relations are what builds the stuff of life, gives our lives direction, meaning, and purpose.
I can't think of a finer note to finish on, actually, Ian. I think that's incredibly insightful and a magnificent place to say thank you very much indeed.
Oh, thank you very much, John. It's been a pleasure.